Chapter 1. A Fateful Encounter in the Dead of Night. The Sky over Tarsus. 9. A wind-swept colony world at the edge of known space, stretched wide and open. A deep violet expanse filled with distant stars that flickered like the eyes of unseen watchers. It was the kind of sky that made a man feel small, insignificant, as though the universe could swallow him whole at any moment and not even notice. It was also the kind of sky that promised danger, where the law barely reached, and where those who found themselves on the wrong side of power were quickly forgotten. That was why Daniel Carter was out here. The colony world had once been a bustling frontier hub, a place where settlers and fortune-seekers arrived in droves, believing they could carve out a piece of the galaxy for themselves. But the dream had faded, and like most outposts on the edge of civilization, Tarsus 9 had fallen into the hands of those who had no interest in dreams-only power. Corporations, warlords, and syndicates had carved up the land, enforcing their own laws, deciding who thrived and who suffered. Daniel had long since learned not to get involved in the affairs of such people. He was a mechanic, a man who fixed things, not a hero. But when the distress signal came through his private channel, he knew he couldn't ignore it. It had been a faint transmission, barely a whisper over the static, an old military frequency no one used anymore. It had been garbled, but he could make out enough. Someone was in trouble, someone was trapped, and they didn't have long. The urgency in that broken signal had settled in his chest like a lead weight. So now he was here, riding his old speeder bike across the barren outskirts, where the remnants of the old railway stretched across the landscape like the ribs of a long-dead beast. The tracks had once carried goods across the planet before space travel had made them obsolete, but some of the lines were still active, used by the syndicates to transport cargo and prisoners. And as Daniel followed the signal, he knew that was exactly what he was heading toward. Ahead, the rusting rails shimmered under the twin moons, cutting a dark path toward the hills. The air was still, unnaturally so. Even the desert winds seemed to be holding their breath. And then, beneath the distant hum of his speeder's engine, he heard the rhythmic rumble of an oncoming train. It was still far off, but approaching fast. Daniel slowed the speeder and scanned the area. The distress signal had originated near these tracks, and if he was right, whoever had sent it was about to be in a very bad situation. His fingers tightened on the handlebars, heart pounding as he leaned forward, pushing the speeder faster. And then he saw her. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The shadows along the tracks were deep, the moonlight only offering glimpses between the long steel rails and the dust swirling in the air. But as he got closer, the shape became clear. A woman, chained to the tracks. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Someone had left her there. She wasn't just bound, she had been shackled. Her wrists and ankles secured with heavy restraints, thick metal cuffs attached to the tracks themselves. She struggled weakly against them, her movements sluggish, as though she barely had the strength left to fight. Her clothes, a torn military-style jumpsuit, were dirted and stained, and her body bore the signs of bruises, of mistreatment. But it was her eyes that struck him most. Glowing, alien, terrified. She was not human. Daniel didn't have time to process that. The train was coming. He gunned the speeder forward, skidding to a stop beside the tracks, dust billowing around him as he jumped off and ran to her. Her eyes locked onto his, widening in shock and disbelief. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak, hoarse. "You came?" He crouched beside her, already working on the cuffs. "We don't have time for introductions, lady. We gotta move." She gasped, shaking her head, struggling against the bindings. "They left me here. They said no one would come." Daniel glanced up at the tracks, at the distant light of the oncoming train. Too close. The bindings were advanced military-grade locks, designed to keep prisoners secured even in transport. He cursed under his breath. He could try cutting through them, but he didn't have the right tools for that here. She must have seen his hesitation, because she shook her head. "Leave me." Daniel's jaw clenched. Not happening. He pulled out his plasma torch and ignited it, the blue flame flickering as he brought it to the first set of cuffs. It wasn't strong enough to cut through in time, but it might weaken the metal just enough. Sparks flew as he worked, the heat scorching the already worn edges of the cuffs. The train was too close now. Its horn blared, the sound vibrating through his bones. It wasn't stopping. The woman gasped, her body tensing. "You won't make it, Dash." Daniel dropped the torch and made a decision. With a grunt, he grabbed her one arm around her waist, the other wrenching against the bindings with everything he had. He pulled, ignoring the pain in his shoulders, the strain in his muscles. The cuffs groaned, metal bending, but not fast enough. The train was seconds away. She struggled against him, fear flashing in her glowing eyes. "Let me go," she gasped. He ignored her. With one final, desperate heave, he pulled her free. The moment the cuffs snapped, they fell backward onto the gravel, rolling away just as the train thundered past. The sheer force of it shook the ground, sending dust and debris flying into the air, the wind from its passage nearly deafening. Daniel lay there for a moment, chest rising and falling, arms aching from the exertion. She was still in his arms, shaking, alive. He let out a breath, turning his head toward her. "You okay?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes still wide with shock, but as she stared at him, something shifted in her expression. A mix of disbelief and something deeper. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You saved me?" Daniel smirked. "Guess I did." Silence stretched between them, the train now a distant blur fading into the night. Then, her expression hardened. "They're coming back?" Daniel tensed. "Who?" She sat up, wincing, rubbing at the marks where the cuffs had been. Her alien features were striking now that he could see her properly. High cheekbones, sharp but elegant ridges along her forehead, and markings running down her arms, markings that seemed to pulse faintly, reacting to her distress. Her eyes flickered toward the hills, where shadows moved in the distance. "The ones who put me here." Daniel clenched his fists. So this wasn't over yet. He reached for his weapon, helping her to her feet. "Then let's make sure they regret it." And together, they turned toward the darkness, toward the approaching figures, and toward whatever fate had in store for them next. Chapter 2. The hunt begins. The dust from the trains passing still hung in the air, swirling around them as the rumble of its departure echoed into the distance. Daniel's pulse was still pounding in his ears, but his instincts told him the real danger hadn't passed yet. His fingers curled tightly around the grip of his plasma pistol, and he could already see the movement in the hills beyond the tracks. The woman beside him, alien, betrayed, and until moments ago, left for dead, was still breathing hard, but there was no hesitation in her as she straightened up. Even exhausted, she had the stance of a fighter. Daniel had seen plenty of people abandoned in this system before, but never like this. Chained to a set of tracks, left for an execution that didn't even require a gunman. It was more than murder, it was a message. Someone had wanted her death to be slow, inevitable, and undeniable. Someone had wanted her to know that no one would come for her. But now, the ones who had left her there would realize their mistake. Daniel glanced at her again. She was rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had bitten deep into her skin. But the moment she caught him watching, she straightened and met his eyes. In the dim moonlight, he could see the faint bioluminescent markings on her arms flicker slightly, an unconscious response to stress or pain, maybe. Her kind wasn't common around here, but he had seen enough travelers to recognize she wasn't some random drifter. She was someone important, or at least, someone dangerous enough that someone had gone through a lot of trouble to get rid of her. "You got a name?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She hesitated, as if debating whether to trust him. But then she exhaled, shoulders still tense. "Vena," she said. "And you?" "Daniel." Another pause, but she nodded. "They'll be back," she said, glancing toward the hills. "They never leave a job half finished." Daniel followed her gaze. The shapes in the distance were moving fast, figures cutting across the rocky terrain with precision, not just a gang of amateurs. He had been around enough mercenary crews to know a retrieval team when he saw one. These weren't just thugs sent to finish off a prisoner. They were here for a reason. "How many?" he asked. Vena's eyes narrowed. "At least 5, maybe more. Armed." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Great. Well, if they were smart, they'd assume the train did their job for them." She shook her head. "They won't. They'll check the site." Of course they would. If they had gone through the trouble of chaining her up like that, they weren't going to leave until they saw the proof. Which meant they had, at best, a few minutes before they realized she was missing. Daniel didn't like their odds if they stayed put. "Come on," he said, already moving toward his speeder. "We need to move." Vena hesitated, then followed. The speeder wasn't made for two riders, but there wasn't another option. Daniel mounted it first, revving the engine, while Vena swung up behind him, her arms hesitantly wrapping around his waist. The moment she was secure, he gunned the throttle, and the vehicle shot forward, kicking up dust as they raced away from the tracks. Behind them, the shadows crept closer. Running from the ghosts of the past, Daniel's speeder cut through the night, the engine growling as they moved across the uneven landscape. He had spent enough time on Tarsus, 9 to know there were few places to hide in the open desert. The terrain was mostly flat, broken by occasional rock formations and dried riverbeds. If they wanted to lose their pursuers, they needed a plan. Vena shifted slightly behind him, looking over her shoulder. "They're following us." Daniel didn't need to turn around to confirm it. He had heard the distant hum of their own speeders coming to life, the sound of engines roaring into pursuit. "Of course they are," he muttered. He gunned the throttle, pushing the speeder harder, but his old machine wasn't built for high-speed chases. It had been reliable, sure, but it was far from a state-of-the-art model. The mercenaries chasing them, on the other hand, had access to something far faster, and they were closing the gap. A shot rang out, a plasma bolt sizzling past them, kicking up dirt just to their left. Vena cursed, her grip on him tightening. "They're trying to disable the speeder," she shouted over the wind. Daniel grimaced. "Yeah, I noticed." Another shot closer this time. The mercenaries weren't firing to kill. They wanted them alive. That meant Vena was valuable. More valuable than just some escaped prisoner. Who the hell was she? The ground ahead dropped off suddenly into a ravine, the dried bed of an old river. Daniel made a split-second decision and jerked the speeder into a sharp turn, diving into the rocky trench below. The vehicle jolted as they hit uneven ground, but the walls of the ravine offered them at least some cover from the incoming fire. Vena held on tighter, her breath ragged. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they can't follow," Daniel gritted out. Up ahead, the ravine narrowed into a cavern system, barely visible against the dark cliffs. He had only been through this way once before, but he knew the entrance was wide enough for a speeder just barely. He aimed for it, pushing the engine past its limits. The mercenaries saw his plan and opened fire again, their bolts slamming into the rocks around them, sending shards of debris scattering across the path. Daniel gritted his teeth as one of the shots clipped the rear of the speeder, sending it into a brief skid. They were running out of time. With one last burst of speed, he aimed for the cavern mouth and they plunged inside. Into the dark. The transition from the open desert to the cave was instant and jarring. The speeder's headlights flickered against the stone walls as the space tightened around them. The passage was barely wide enough for their vehicle, but Daniel forced it through, weaving between jagged rocks as he tried to put as much distance between them and their pursuers as possible. Vena looked behind them. No lights. No movement. "They didn't follow," she breathed. Daniel slowed the speeder, bringing it to a stop in a wide chamber deep within the caves. The only sounds now were their ragged breathing and the hum of the still active engine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vena exhaled. That was close. Daniel let out a dry chuckle, running a hand through his dust-covered hair. "Yeah, I think that qualifies as a close call." She slid off the speeder, her legs still unsteady. Her hands went to her wrists again, rubbing at the marks the chains had left. In the dim light, Daniel could see her more clearly now. She was tall, lean, built for speed rather than brute strength. Her species, whatever it was, had faint bioluminescent veins that pulsed along her arms, fading and brightening in time with her breath. Her dark silver-blue skin had a few fresh bruises, but her eyes were sharp, determined, and they were watching him just as closely as he was watching her. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You want to tell me why they left you out there to die?" Vena hesitated. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze to his. "Because I know something they don't want me to tell." Daniel exhaled. He figured as much. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 3. Secrets of the Betrayed. The cavern walls loomed around them, jagged and cold, illuminated only by the dim glow of Daniel's speeder's headlights and the faint bioluminescence that pulsed along Vena's skin. The air was damp, carrying the scent of old minerals and stagnant water, but it was quiet, too quiet. Daniel knew from experience that the absence of sound didn't mean they were safe. It only meant the enemy hadn't found them yet. Vena sat on a nearby rock, rubbing at her wrists where the restraints had dug into her flesh. She hadn't spoken much since they'd escaped the train tracks, but now that they weren't actively being shot at, Daniel could feel the tension radiating off her like heat from an overworked reactor. Daniel leaned against the speeder, arms crossed. All right, time to start talking. She looked up, her glowing eyes unreadable. About what? He gave her a pointed look. You know exactly what. Who were those guys, and why the hell did they want you dead? She exhaled sharply, tilting her head back against the rock, eyes momentarily fluttering shut. For a long moment, he thought she wasn't going to answer, but then, her voice came low, tight, edged with something between anger and exhaustion. Because I found out something I wasn't supposed to. Daniel's brow furrowed. Care to elaborate? Her fingers drummed against her knee, the soft glow in her veins flickering in agitation. You ever heard of the Tyrak Syndicate? Daniel stiffened. He had. The Tyrak Syndicate wasn't just another gang of criminals operating in the shadows of the frontier. They were an empire, a network of smugglers, slavers, mercenaries, and corrupt officials stretching across multiple systems. If something illegal was happening in the Outer Rim, the Syndicate was either involved or taking a cut. And if Vena had crossed them, it explained why someone had gone through the trouble of chaining her to a set of train tracks rather than just putting a bullet in her head. The Syndicate didn't just kill people. They made examples of them. Daniel let out a slow breath. Well, that's a hell of a group to piss off. Vena smirked, but there was no humor in it. You have no idea. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, thinking. He dealt with Syndicate goons before, but never directly. Never personally. They were the kind of people you avoided if you wanted to live a long life. But he had also never met anyone who had escaped from them and lived to talk about it. What exactly did you find out? He asked carefully. Her expression darkened. They're planning something. Something big. They've been moving resources, weapons, and people. Her voice caught slightly on the last word. A lot of people have gone missing in the last few months, and the Syndicate has been covering their tracks too well for it to be coincidence. Daniel frowned. Slavery? She hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. I don't think so. At least, not in the way you'd expect. Daniel's gut twisted. What do you mean? Vena exhaled, her fingers clenching into fists. I don't have all the answers, but I do know that whatever they're doing, it's not just about money. They're preparing for something. Something big enough that they were willing to kill me to keep me quiet. Daniel stared at her. She wasn't lying. He didn't know her well, but he had a decent read on people. There was fear in her voice. Yes, but there was something else beneath it, determination. A need to make sure someone else knew what she had seen. Which meant he was now holding information that the most dangerous criminal organization in the sector wanted buried. He sighed. Well, that's just fantastic. The hunter becomes the hunted. Before Daniel could respond, a faint noise echoed through the cavern. Not loud, not obvious, but distinct enough that every muscle in his body went rigid. Vena heard it too. She was on her feet instantly, her glowing eyes scanning the darkness beyond the cave entrance. Daniel slowly reached for his weapon. They found us. Vena didn't answer, but her stance shifted a readiness that told him she was more than capable of fighting if it came down to it. A second sound. A flicker of movement at the cave entrance. Daniel cursed under his breath. Move. Vena didn't hesitate. They sprinted deeper into the cavern, just as blaster fire erupted behind them. The shots illuminated the dark for split seconds, casting long shadows against the walls, the sharp crack of energy bolts echoing in the confined space. Daniel skidded behind a rock, pulling his pistol and returning fire. Vena was beside him in an instant, moving with a fluidity that suggested she had been in situations like this before. Any ideas? She asked. Daniel grimaced. Survive first, plan later. More shots rang out. The Syndicate's men were spreading out, blocking the only exit. If they got pinned here, it wouldn't matter how well they fought. We need to get out of this cave, Daniel muttered. There's another way, right? Vena hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. There might be. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Might. I've only seen old maps, she admitted. No guarantee it's still open. Daniel smirked. Well, I like those odds better than dying here. They moved quickly, staying low, dodging fire as they weaved deeper into the cave system. The syndicate's men followed, their voices growing louder, their movements more aggressive. They weren't just trying to kill them. They were trying to capture her. Daniel's mind raced. If they wanted her alive, it meant she was worth more to them breathing than dead. That was information they could use, if they survived long enough to use it. The desperate escape. The deeper they ran, the more the cave narrowed, forcing them to move in single file. The flickering glow of Vena's skin was the only light guiding them now. Daniel could still hear the pursuers behind them, but the further they went, the harder it would be for the enemy to follow. Then they reached the drop. It wasn't a dead end, but it might as well have been. The passage opened up into a deep cavern, a sheer drop into darkness with no visible way across. Vena cursed. The bridge is gone. Daniel looked down, jaw tightening. It wasn't just gone, it had collapsed long ago. The stone crumbled into nothingness. Behind them, the sound of syndicate operatives closing in grew louder. They were out of time. Vena turned to him. We jump. Daniel blinked. We what now? She stepped back, readying herself. It's not as far as it looks. There's an outcrop down there. If we hit the right angle, we'll make it. Daniel stared at her. You're insane. She flashed a sharp grin. You coming or not? Before he could argue, she leaped. Daniel watched as she twisted midair, landing hard on a lower rock formation just barely visible in the dark. She turned back up to him, smirking. Your turn, human. Daniel took a deep breath. I hate my life. And then he jumped. Chapter 4. The Syndicate's Wrath. Daniel hit the rock hard, rolling to absorb the impact as best he could. The landing still sent a sharp pain through his shoulder, but at least he hadn't broken anything. He exhaled sharply, looking up to see Vena already on her feet, scanning the darkness ahead. Her glowing veins pulsed faintly, her body tensed like a coiled spring. The woman moved with the precision of someone who had fought her way out of death before. The echoes of syndicate operatives grew louder above them. The goons hadn't jumped after them, not yet. They were trying to find another way down. Daniel didn't plan to be around when they did. You got an actual plan, he muttered, shaking the numbness out of his hand. Or are we just running toward more trouble? Vena didn't look at him as she started moving. I told you, there were old maps that said this cave connects to an exit on the far side of the ridge. But that was a long time ago. We don't know if it's collapsed. Daniel sighed. You really suck at making things sound hopeful, you know that? She smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. You're still alive, aren't you? For now. She didn't wait for his response. She started moving deeper into the cavern, and Daniel had no choice but to follow. The tunnel of the forgotten. The cave stretched on, narrowing and widening in strange, irregular patterns. The deeper they went, the older it felt. The walls weren't just natural formations anymore. There were signs of something artificial. Stonework, collapsed structures, old carvings worn down by time and erosion. Daniel ran a hand over the wall as they passed. This isn't just a cave. Someone built into it. Vena nodded. A long time ago. Before humans ever set foot on Tarsus. 9. Daniel frowned. You think this place was a city? Not a city, she corrected, running her fingers over an old symbol carved into the rock. It glowed faintly under her touch, reacting to her energy. A burial ground? Daniel immediately regretted asking. You're saying we're walking through a graveyard? She tilted her head, thoughtful. The dead don't mind. Daniel muttered under his breath. I might. The passage descended deeper, the air growing cooler. The syndicate's men weren't far behind. They weren't shouting anymore, they were moving cautiously now, their footsteps controlled, their weapons at the ready. They knew they had their prey cornered. Daniel wasn't about to let that happen. They moved fast, navigating through the narrowing corridors, following faint markings left by whoever had used these tunnels before. The deeper they went, the more Daniel's gut told him something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged, like the walls themselves were watching. Then, ahead of them, the tunnel split. Vena slowed. Damn it. Daniel came up beside her, looking down the two diverging paths. One was wide, but led into pure darkness, with no visible end. The other was narrower, jagged, filled with collapsed debris and broken stone. "Which way?" he asked. Vena hesitated, biting her lip. "The left path should lead to the surface, but if it's caved in too much dash." "We're screwed," Daniel finished. Before she could respond, a voice echoed from behind them. "They went this way. Move in." Daniel swore. "Well, that settles it. Left it is." They ran. The collapse. The tunnel wasn't just narrow, it was unstable. Each step sent small rocks crumbling down from the ceiling, and Daniel knew that if the syndicate thugs started firing behind them, this whole passage could come crashing down. Vena moved with fluid grace, her steps careful but quick, her bioluminescent veins flashing brighter now, as if reacting to the air itself. Daniel had no time to ask why, he just kept moving. The footsteps behind them were getting louder. "They're too close," Vena hissed. Daniel didn't need her to tell him that. If they didn't put some distance between themselves and the pursuers, it wouldn't matter if they found the exit, they'd be gunned down before they reached it. Then, he saw it. A weak point in the tunnel, a section where the ceiling had already partially collapsed. One good hit, and it would cave in completely. He skidded to a stop, turning to Vena. "Keep going." She blinked. "What?" "No dash. They need to be slowed down," he said, already pulling a small charge from his belt. "I can buy us time." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded once. "Don't take too long." Then she was gone. Daniel worked fast, slapping the improvised explosive against the weak point. He wasn't a demolitions expert, but he knew how to make things fall apart. The moment he heard the syndicate's men closing in, he triggered the charge. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough. The walls and ceiling shuddered, then cracked. And then, with a groaning roar, the tunnel collapsed in on itself. Dust filled the air, the sound of falling stone drowning out the shouts of their pursuers. For a few long moments, Daniel stood there, chest heaving, staring at the rubble. He didn't know if he had killed them or just delayed them, but either way, they weren't following him now. He turned and ran after Vena. The syndicate's wrath. By the time Daniel caught up, Vena was already at the surface exit. The tunnel opened into the night air, overlooking the vast dunes of Tarsus IX's wasteland. She turned as he approached. "Did it work?" "For now," he said, catching his breath. "But they're not going to give up that easy." Vena stared into the distance, her expression grim. "No, they won't." Daniel studied her. "So what do we do now?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she turned to him. "We fight back." Daniel blinked. "I was afraid you were going to say that." She smirked. "They won't stop hunting me. Not after this. But we have something they don't." Daniel folded his arms. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Vena's bioluminescent markings pulsed, glowing brighter than before. She smiled. "The truth." And as the first signs of dawn broke over the desert horizon, Daniel realized that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.